The uneven recovery kind of took the sails out of any sort of bullish feeling within the equity index. And I have to ask, how is it uneven? Is it uneven on country versus country, within countries? Is it industry versus industry? Walk me through the thesis.
Hi, Alex. It's uneven on all fronts. So it is uneven across countries. So you're seeing advanced economies doing better than emerging and developing economies, excluding China. Within countries, it's uneven. You're seeing low-skilled workers, youth, women doing worse in labor markets. So we're seeing rising inequality, and the poor are getting poorer. So, and also sectorally, we're seeing manufacturing having strength and recovering on a month-to-month basis. But on the other hand, services sector is either stalling or even reversing in some parts of the world because we're still living with this virus.
Gita, you talk about the effect of this virus being longer. Does that mean the damage is going to be ultimately greater despite the more shallow trajectory?
I mean, overall, again, this is the worst crisis since the Great Depression, and we have very prolonged recoveries. So for most countries, with the exception of China, they don't recover to 2019 levels even by end 2021. And then there are regions like Latin America where that takes until 2023. And this is a permanent loss to output in terms of over the medium term. We have about 28 trillion that's being lost because of this crisis relative to the pre-pandemic level. So yes, this is going to be slow. This is why we describe this as a long, uneven, and highly uncertain ascent.
What can stop it? And I know the IMF has been front and center saying, guys, don't worry about debt. Governments just spend, spend, spend to help support your economies. That seems to be coming to some kind of halt. Stalled stimulus here in the U.S., over in the U.K., it's a more targeted furlough program. We still can't get the recovery fund passed over in Europe. Well, how do you look at it?
So I think the number one thing countries need to do and work much more closely together is on ending this health crisis. I mean, the problem is not science. We're getting, the prospect of vaccines and better treatments and better testing, but just not enough production of the scale that's required to reach everybody in the world. And if that doesn't happen, we're living with this crisis, and that's just going to prolong the recovery. Yes, we're asking countries, especially those that have fiscal space, not to prematurely withdraw support, to continue to provide income support. Now, you can be targeted because countries are at different stages of lockdowns. Some places you're more open than others, so you can be much more targeted in terms of how you are providing the support. But it is important not to withdraw support at this time. And for countries that just don't have the finances, they will need international assistance, concessional financing, aid, debt relief. But that's needed to kind of ensure that we're not going to knock this economy off its path for the foreseeable future.
The crisis is going to go on for a long time. You've certainly laid that out and made that clear. Debt levels are going to be significant as a result of this. How big a drag will the enormous debt that many countries are going to now be carrying be in terms of economic growth far into the future?
So we have debt now projected to be a record high of 100% of global GDP. But this is also at a time when private savings are high and private investment is very weak, which is part of the reason why interest rates are very low at this point and expected to stay that way for the foreseeable future. So to the extent that interest rates stay low and we get a growth rebound in 2021, there are many countries for whom the debt level will stabilize and start coming down. But that said, all that this means is that you have a window of opportunity to kind of build a medium-term fiscal framework to make sure that your debt is going to be sustainable over the next several years. Now, that in some cases that will require, cutting back certain expenditures, which are in many cases wasteful, but also through greater revenue generation. In some cases, greater progressivity, making sure the corporations pay their fair share of taxes. I mean, all of this, greater transparency. All of this will be important. But we have a breathing space now because of the world we're in with low interest rates.
Do all countries have that breathing room? I mean, what happens to really developing economies? I mean, at the end of the day, is it going to come up to the IMF just to forgive that debt so they can try and grow their way out of this?
No, the extraordinary central bank support that's been put in the system has helped many emerging market and developing economies. I mean, in March, we had a financial catastrophe, which was then, completely stabilized, and the outflows that we were seeing from emerging markets, you're seeing inflows going back in, though that's weakening right now. In fact, you had record issuances in many emerging and developing economies in terms of hard currency borrowing. So there is, for many of them, there's no big liquidity problem at this time. But that said, there are frontier economies, there are economies that are low investment grade or are not investment grade economies where they're borrowing at high rates. And for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, they haven't been able to issue any new debt since February. And then, yes, there were countries that are in debt distress. They came into this crisis in debt distress, and things make it just that much harder for them. That will require debt relief, but also in some cases it will just require debt restructuring. This is not something they should kick the can down the road. You really want to deal with it now so they have the resources to spend on this crisis.
In terms of China's economic trajectory, it certainly looks like it's on the best course at the moment. As you look at the fan chart, what is the upper end of what China could be expected ultimately to deliver as it emerges earlier and potentially has greater control of the virus? What is that going to do to the long-term trajectory of the Chinese economy relative to others?
So China is the country where over this year and next is cumulatively going to be 10% higher than the pre-COVID level, while pretty much everywhere else in the world they're going to be below their pre-COVID level. So you do see a very stark difference over here. China also has a lot of underlying growth coming into this crisis. They were slowing down, but still at growth rates of over 5%, between 5 and 6%. So going forward, they will continue to accumulate higher levels of income. But that said, by 2025, we still have them about 1% below their pre-COVID projected path in 2025. But that's a much smaller gap than we have for many other parts of the world.
Sure, and I also wonder, what kind of industries do you think are kind of toast? No matter how much money you throw at them. This is a sort of big structural shift within most economies where you just can't fix it. What are those industries, and what are the countries that are tied to that just will have to revamp their whole economy? And that's a whole different task than just pumping more money in to survive.
Indeed. What we are seeing, if you look at the growth numbers and the pace of recoveries, you're seeing the countries that are much more dependent on contact-intensive services sectors, tourism, hospitality, travel. Those are countries where the recovery is just taking that much longer. While countries that are dependent more on manufacturing are doing better and having somewhat faster recoveries. So indeed, there are sectors, for instance, like travel. Even post this pandemic, I don't think many of us are going to travel as much as we did. So that's a sector that is going to have a long-term hit. While on the other hand, sectors like e-commerce, the digital economy, all of that is booming at this time. I think what we need to ensure, of course, is that there's going to be jobs and a job-rich recovery, which is why we also emphasize why public infrastructure investment is one way of doing that. It helps to create jobs. And not just that, it actually is fiscally sound too, because it has such a big positive effect on GDP that it can actually bring down debt to GDP levels. So green public infrastructure investment really can boost economies and recoveries and bring back jobs.
Gita, what do you got penciled in for the dollar? There is a growing expectation, certainly in financial markets, that we're going to see an increasingly weak dollar. And I'm wondering how much support that is going to provide to the rest of the world. So I'm curious as to what you've got baked in.
The dollar has went up and down since the start of this year. And what we have is where it is about now, which is, over the last 7 months, it's about 1 or 2% depreciated, right? Again, depends on checking. You have to check the news on a minute-to-minute basis for this. The main difference, of course, is that the U.S. had more space to cut interest rates. So once the financial market stress went away, the rush to safe assets that declined, then the appreciation that we saw of the dollar reversed some. And also, again, you've had more space to cut interest rates in the U.S. than in, for instance, the euro area. And you've had the new monetary policy framework, which projects a fairly dovish stance for several years going forward. And also in the euro area, you've had more optimism because of, for instance, the EU-wide recovery fund and other EU-wide proposals. So I don't think I would read too much at this point into dollar movements. There's not that much in these movements in terms of big impact for the global economy.